what?
Hello everyone. I finished a piece on Substack that I'm going to put in the description below. Also buy my book. And that piece was about a topic that I've had thoughts on for years by this point, and decided to just finally write a short essay on it. And that is the fact that there's no such thing as genre fiction, or to be even far more precise, all fiction is genre fiction. Now, growing up, I've always read a lot. I've always liked to think that I've read well. In many ways, you sort of get to a point where you don't really care as long as you enjoy it. I still challenge myself quite a bit with literature in general. And I mean literature in general is like anything written. So sometimes I do a lot of eat your spinach writing in the form of very dense, but I think rewarding philosophy and theory. Other times I read stuff a little more junky. And when it comes to fiction itself, outside of, let's say, core classic canon, and I teach a lot of that. I teach a huge variety of books because at my school's so small. I teach 9th grade, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade English literature. So I read and reread the classics very often, and I haven't read every classic by any means, and I don't like every classic by any means, but when it comes to fiction outside of the classical canon, I'm usually nowhere near as interested in finding what is good or mature. I still like to think that I read well. But even then, I'll admit, there is fiction that's more of a TV dinner variety, which is fine. And there's fiction that's kind of mid-level. And then there's that fiction which tends to be known as literary fiction. And we're going to talk about that today and what I think that actually means. I was in graduate school. I got a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I focused on poetry, and I did some fiction workshops. And I'm now writing more fiction than I ever have before and enjoying it. But at the program I attended, which was the University of Colorado in Boulder, there's a big emphasis, which I thought was very, very attractive, on literary theory and literary analysis. Some MFA programs, which might have been a little more low residency and a little higher up on the poets and writers list, will be dominated almost completely by workshops. But CU Boulder really wanted anyone who's getting a Master's of Fine Arts degree within the English department. And that's the thing. It is within the English department. It's not in the arts department, despite being a Master's of Fine Arts in the English department. And as such, there was a very high academic emphasis on literary theory. And I learned so much in those classes. But one thing I learned very early, and I love this, was a professor outright told me, all fiction is genre fiction. And what is referred to as non-genre or literary fiction is realism. That is, especially in North America or English-speaking countries, that is the genre of fiction which is literary. It is realism, but it doesn't go by that name. It's as if realism is not a genre that doesn't have rules and formulae and tropes and cliches and everything else. Now, I really enjoyed this because not only did it make me feel a little less guilty on some of the things I read, but far more importantly, it gave me an understanding of what great literature can be and why so much great literature is so often dismissed. In a video not that long ago, I discussed Jorge Luis Borges, and I'd written a very long analytical essay attempting to understand on a structural basis what was going on in his fiction The Garden of Forking Paths. And I said in that video, it's always very irritating and distressing to me the fact that Borges never received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, I believe in his case it was more political than anything else. But I also get the sense, had Jorge Luis Borges been an English speaker and wrote the exact same work, he would have been even more ignored by the literary establishment. Because there's a degree in which, if you write Spanish, you get to indulge in a genre like magical realism and it becomes literary. If you do that in the English language, it's genre fiction. I think this is, needless to say, true. Now, my parents are big fans of Alice Munro's short stories. I'm not going to comment on the recent controversies. To me, that's neither here nor there when it comes to the art. I enjoy her short stories. They are not my favorite. I also remember in graduate school one fiction writer whose work I liked, who said he hated her work and that it was beyond banal. And I completely understand what he means, but Alice Munro is really at the pinnacle of what is often considered high literary fiction, that is non-genre fiction. It is realism. It's very well done realism. That's not to say that it's 100% nihilistic, or that it's 100% without any spiritual value, or that it's totally based on pure human psychology and relationships. But those tend to be the concerns generally and vaguely of realism as a genre. So, realism is this genre which is not truthfully predicated on the idea that I'm going to write fiction which conforms to how things really are. That's not what it means. No one actually knows how things really are. Believe you me. And of course, depending on who you ask, someone's totally real Weltanschauung, their worldview, involves absolutely no spiritual element. For someone else, everything is spiritual. For someone else, there's a triune God at the center of everything. For someone else, there's no God, but there is some benevolent force at the center of everything. For someone else, there's God, but it doesn't matter. And you can go on and on and on. And that's just God, which is incredibly important. But there's so many other ways of understanding reality. Realism, generally speaking, tends to accept a fully material universe. Not always, but generally speaking. It tends to accept that if things occur which go against a materialistic understanding of the universe, those things are by de facto miracles in the Humean sense. By the way, just as an aside, I'll have to do a video on this at some point. Isn't it really odd that even people who believe in miracles, their definition of what a miracle is comes from an atheist, David Hume. That's dumb, but that's what happens. I used to be a person like that. Okay, so if something completely out of bounds happens in a fully material universe, it has to be a miracle. In realism, psychology is the most important aspect of the high literary fiction, and that's often why we really like great novels of a realistic bent. We are indulging in understanding the minds and relationships of other human beings. That's not always what happens in realism, just like not all realism is materialistic, but it tends to be this way. And I would say another very important postulate of realism as a genre is that structurally, these works of fiction, these novels, these plays, films, but especially novels and works of fiction, structurally, we see things happen almost always in a very standard A, B, C, D, E, F chronology. Occasionally, within chapters, let's say, of a novel, you will mess around with temporalities in a way that's pretty standard, right? Someone will have a flashback, they'll go into a memory, they'll be reminded of something. But generally speaking, we don't have great experiments with the structure. When a work of realist fiction does that, it's really treading into the territory of postmodernism, which in my opinion is a much more interesting literary genre. Postmodern fiction, generally speaking, is more intriguing, has a lot more to say. It's aware of what it is, whereas realism structurally tends to not want to be aware that it's fiction, which again is sort of funny because I feel that literature of the highest quality should have an awareness of that. Obviously, not every film is a comment on filmmaking, or should be. Not every novel is a comment on novel writing, or should be. But there should, in my opinion, be a gesture towards that. And in many ways, that's what I think modernism did. Modernism in the arts, especially in the narrative arts, forced audiences and authors to be aware of what writing is and not pretend they were engaged in some other activity. So if we go by the postulates of realism and we pretend it's not realism and we say literary fiction is not genre fiction, then you begin to understand why certain books, especially in the English language, that is, books that are not translated, tend to only get awards, rewards, high praise from critics if they're works of realism. Now, I should mention, here's another postulate of realism, maybe the final one. All literature of any type, fiction, non-fiction, plays, philosophical treatises, all literature of any type can have a comment on the social and the political. Realism as a genre tends to be one where it's expected you make a comment on society or culture or politics or some other quote-unquote issue. Again, that happens in all other genres. And not every work of realism is going to do that. But there tends to be this idea that if I'm going to write realism, I should acknowledge what's happening in the world and have something to say about that. There's nothing wrong with that. I just want to mention it's a typical postulate. That's the term I keep using. But there's great literature that is science fiction. There's great literature that are thrillers. There's great literature that is horror. I did a video on horror and that vampire novel by Todd Grimson, a fantastic novel, absolutely high work of art in my opinion, and about how horror in our day and age is our link to the ancient understanding of what tragedy is, the ancient and medieval understanding of what tragedy is. There are great works of literature that happen to be spy novels, mystery novels. They're great works of literature that happen to be fill in the blank, that are quote-unquote genre fiction, that are not works of realism. And to that end today, I want to talk about Philip K. Dick. And specifically, I want to talk about his novel, A Scanner Darkly, which I would say is his best work. Now, I have not read every novel of Philip K. Dick. He was quite prolific. I've actually never read any of his short stories either, which I need to get to. I would say I've read the works that are considered major, which does not mean I've read his best works. That's another attitude you sometimes get with the literary crowd. You know, there's major this and there's minor that. No, a work might have a higher reception, it might have had a greater impact, and of course, there's a difference between the best work and one's personal favorite, one's preferences. That's absolutely fine. But generally speaking, I'd say I've read the major ones. Scanner Darkly, The Man in the High Castle, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Let's see. Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said. Ubik. God, that's a fantastic one. And some others that I've read that maybe aren't as major, but I think are quite good. Maze of Death is very interesting. Very interesting, philosophically especially. Challenging, interesting. And Martian Time Slip has some good moments. It's definitely a little weaker. One novel his I've read that I really didn't like was called Counterclock World. I don't really know what to say. The characters were very wooden, and it seemed that he was so interested in this idea, and it was just a vehicle for the idea. Now let me explain why when someone argues for genre fiction as against literary fiction, i.e. realism, why we can accept this, why it makes sense to us. Typically when someone says genre fiction, what they're saying is, you are reading a work of fiction, whether it be a short story or a novel or potentially a play, what have you, in which the emphasis is always something outside of the quality of writing. Okay, yeah, fair enough. That can hold up a lot. You know, you read a work of fantasy, and the whole point of that particular work of fantasy is the author simply wanting to show you their world building. You read dystopian novel, and the whole point of that dystopian novel is the author's trying to say, A, look at this destroyed world I've made, and B, look at the comment I'm making about climate change or racism or fill in the blank. Right? That's very typical of dystopians. And to be fair, I think you can have a great work of literature that doesn't necessarily put great writing at the top. I think it's difficult, but I think that can happen. But generally speaking, I see what they mean. The problem I have is there's a lot of quote-unquote works of realism, celebrated realism, especially contemporary works of realism, that don't have very good writing, but because they make political and ideological comments, they're great. They might be pretty decent, but they don't deserve the praise of being great works of literature. And so, in the end, the argument that there is a vast distinction between non-genre fiction, realism, and genre fiction is bullshit. It's simply not the case. So when we are looking at high-quality genre fiction, Southern Gothic, murder mystery, thriller, horror, science fiction, dystopian, speculative fiction, I'm generally looking for the best possible writing, the best possible prose, and an understanding of the fact that the structure of a novel should A, be aware that it's a novel, and B, the structure should be enacted within the plot. They should mirror each other. That's, to me, like the really high bar, which means I find more postmodern works to be great literature. Although postmodernism did not invent this mirroring effect, and it's definitely not limited to it. The very first novels in Western literature think and work this way. And again, that's sort of my own take. And I go much further into the details why that is in the Substack essay. So I would say, of the Philip K. Dick I've read, and I'm just now starting the Valis trilogy, which I know is major, so these are premature judgments. But from the Philip K. Dick that I've personally read, I believe his best novel, the one that accomplishes what I think he as an author wants to set out, which is to marry speculative fiction with those science fiction elements. You know, what will this new technology do to human beings? How do we come to understand reality in light of it? What does it do to relationships? he marries that exceptionally with this grand focus on what is the nature of identity in light of God. I've yet to read one Philip K. Dick novel that isn't always already about God. Sometimes it's really obvious, sometimes it's not. But his spiritual explorations are key to his work. In my opinion, what makes him such a fantastic author. And in many ways, there's a lot of science fiction I haven't read, but I mean, compared to like H.G. Wells, there's no contest. Philip K. Dick was a true literary genius and artist. Not every work is as good as others, but Ubik, again, I mean, it follows everything it's supposed to. So from kind of the basic tropes of science fiction, we have new technology, we're in a new world, things are different. How does that change social relations? How does it change our understanding of ourselves? Okay, what does this new technology do? That's there. The other thing it has very well is in Ubik, of course, and maybe I forgot to mention this part. Another thing Philip K. Dick really loves is the existential question from a purely phenomenological level. Okay, how do I experience reality and my knowledge of reality, and how does that give me access to reality? He's very Kafka-esque in that way, but he comes at it from the direction of quote-unquote science fiction, as opposed to modernism proper, the way Kafka did. But then, of course, we get to God and man, and Ubik, which is a brilliant and complicated and strange novel, and brilliant. I said that already. I'll repeat it. It's brilliant. I don't even want to get into the plot. It's been a few years since I've read it. But there's this product that the characters sometimes use. It's in a spray can, and they spray it, and it's called Ubik. And there's this idea that this thing shows up when you need it, and if you believe in it, it works for you. And it's Ubik because it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And in the novel, before each chapter, if I remember correctly, you read this funny ad copy for Ubik. And in the very last chapter, that ad copy for Ubik is not ad copy anymore. It is basically a line of scripture of Ubik identifying itself as the creator God. So God's huge in Philip K. Dick. And I think his explorations and understanding of God are controversial, but well worth meditating upon. So I believe Ubik is his best novel. Again, I need to read more, and that might change. But for me, A Scanner Darkly is my favorite. I think on one hand, it's one of the best dystopias I've ever read, and a very chilling dystopia. It seems kind of realistic. On the other hand, it is not a typical shitty drug book. A shitty drug book is, man, we gotta hide and shit, man, crazy stuff. I've enjoyed a bit of Hunter S. Thompson, but after a while, I don't care. Okay. Whoa, you got high, you saw stuff, you questioned the American dream. Whoa, you shot guns. Whoa, who cares? So it's not that kind of drug novel. It's also, I just think, his best writing. I feel like I'm going to use this adjective because it sounds so stupid, but it's tender. I don't know how to say it. It's moving. It's still paranoid and crazy. You don't know what reality is, and people are trying to understand one another while they're on the substance D, and it's tearing apart their very perception of what reality is. And yet it's so moving. It's not, in my opinion, a madhouse. It's a breakdown. But the other thing, the thing that I really think brings A Scanner Darkly over the line for me is that because it's his best writing, and when I think writing is at its best, it's not just a maturity of prose style or great turns of phrase, although those are very important. It's a writing which is aware of its own structure and enacts its own themes within the very structure. And the plot itself repeats that. So what do I mean in terms of A Scanner Darkly? I don't want to give too much away about the plot. Then again, if I could tell you the entire plot, it would still be worth reading. By the way, I'd say Richard Linklater's, I don't know how you say it, adaptation is a wonderful adaptation. Like a good adaptation, it's its own work of art, and you don't need to compare the two. You can enjoy that film on its own and still want to read the book and vice versa. But Substance D is all over the place, and these people live in Northern California, and there's societal breakdown and there's chaos, and Bob Arctor is a narc. But the drug war is so complex in this world of A Scanner Darkly, and is so fraught that every single narc is essentially an undercover officer. And every single narc only does their official police business. By that, I don't mean their investigations, but I mean applying their investigations, analyzing it, going into the police station, looking at the paperwork, interrogating subjects and witnesses, coming to court. All the official police business, they wear something called a scramble suit. And a scramble suit is very well done in the film. You zip it up, it's like a jumpsuit, and you become this massive digital noise. You look like you're a series of anxious pixels moving apart at lightning speed that walks around. And your voice itself is inconstant. No one will literally know who you are, and it's just by the thinnest amount of paperwork that someone is aware that there's someone up there in the police who knows that you're a narc. Right. And the scramble suit's very important in the novel. So here's what happens to Bob Arctor, which of course is named basically Bob Actor. In fact, when you read it, you keep taking out that awkward second R. Arctor, and you just keep thinking actor, and that's what he is. And Bob Actor, and that's really what I'm going to call him, he gets he gets an assignment from above that he needs to investigate himself. Now, of course, this happens because, well, they are so good at being undercover and divorcing their official police business in the scramble suit with their everyday lives where they're always doing undercover investigations. That's the other thing too. You're never not at work, right? They're so good at this that you literally will be asked to investigate yourself. And of course, part of the reason is because the police, have become aware that he's an addict. And the drug is called Substance D. Now, I'll be honest with you, a bit of a disservice. I forgot to look up a lot of the particulars of this novel. It's been a few years since I've read it. I just reread a few things to myself. But my understanding of Substance D is that it's the depersonalization of depersonalization drugs. It just gets you high in this horrifying sense where you completely abstract yourself from what it means to be a human being and to know your own identity. And it's highly addictive, and I think essentially it mimics or actually begins to separate your corpus callosum, which means you literally become a split brain patient. And anyone who's read about split brain patients, and there's a lot of sources on it, a lot of great documentaries, but Ian McGilchrist has a lot to say about this in his fantastic work, The Master and His Emissary. Yes, I believe that's the title. But split brain patients can literally be like two actual separate people. So, Bob has to investigate himself as a narc and as the officer in the scramble suit. And he begins to literally just not know who he is. And the writing is so good here. You read this novel, which kind of lapses into first person and third person close and third person limited and third person omniscient. Sorry, third person limited and close are the same thing, forgive me. And it changes in all these ways. And then you realize as you're reading it, the book itself is a scramble suit in your hands. It's a coherent presentation of a human being. The scramble suit, you know it's a person, but it's a presentation that's made meaningful by being pure distortion, by being pure noise. It's so good how he pulls it off. And unfortunately, in this edition especially, he's got a short intro, or maybe it's what is it? It's an author's note at the end where he just talks about how drugs and hallucinogens killed and destroyed and maimed the minds of so many people he knew. It was horrible. So I think part of the reason this novel's so good and enacts its structure so expertly is because he lived this life a bit and he was surrounded by people just like this. Okay, as I usually do, I'm going to read a few pages, an excerpt from this novel. I want to say right off the bat that the entire high literary effect of the structure mirroring the themes, and the themes being enacted by the language and the plot, you sort of have to read the whole novel to get that. It's not necessarily going to come across in an excerpt. What will come across is highly imagistic prose, very mature psychological profiling of characters, and just a beautiful, and again tender, and sometimes moving and tonally adept handle on the language. Okay. If I had known it was harmless, I would have killed it myself. That had summed up to them, and still did, what they distrusted in their straight foes, assuming they had foes. Anyhow, a person like well-educated with all the financial advantages, Thelma Cornford, became at once a foe by uttering that, from which they had run that day, pouring out of her apartment and back to their own littered pad, to her perplexity. The gulf between their world and hers had manifested itself, however much they mediated on how to ball her, and remained. Her heart, Bob Arctor reflected, was an empty kitchen. Floor tile and water pipes and a drain board with pale scrubbed surfaces and one abandoned glass on the edge of the sink that nobody cared about. One time before he got solely into undercover work, he had taken a desk position from a pair of upper-class, well-off straights whose furniture had been ripped off during their absence, evidently by junkies. In those days, such people still lived in areas where roving rip-off bands stole what they could, leaving little. Professional bands with walkie-talkies in the hands of spotters who watched a couple miles down the street for the Mark's return. He remembered the man and his wife saying, "People who would burglarize your house and take your color TV are the same kind of criminals who slaughter animals or vandalize priceless works of art." No, Bob Arctor had explained, pausing and writing down their deposition. What makes you believe that? Addicts, in his experience anyhow, rarely hurt animals. He had witnessed junkies feeding and caring for injured animals over long periods of time, where straights probably would have had the animals put to sleep. A straight type term, if there ever was one, and also an old syndicate term as well, for murder. Once he had assisted two totally spaced out heads in the sad ordeal of unscrewing a cat which had impaled itself within a broken window. The heads, hardly able to see or understand anything anymore, had over almost an entire hour deftly and patiently worked the cat loose until she was free, bleeding a little, all of them, heads and cat alike, with the cat calm in their hands, one dude inside the house with Arctor, the other outdoors where the ass and tail were. The cat had come free at last with no real injury, and then they had fed her. They did not know whose cat she was. Evidently, she had been hungry and smelled food through their broken window, and finally, unable to rouse them, had tried to leap in. They'd noticed her until her shriek, and then they'd forgotten their various trips and dreams for a while in her behalf. As to priceless works of art, he wasn't too sure, because he didn't exactly understand what that meant. At My Lai, during the Vietnam War, 450 priceless works of art had been vandalized to death at the orders of the CIA. Priceless works of art plus oxen and chickens and other animals not listed. When he thought about that, he always got a little dingy and was hard to reason with about paintings in museums like that. Just beautiful, beautiful. I've mentioned all Philip K. Dick's work have something to do with God. I would say in A Scanner Darkly, it's a little more subtle. Obviously, the title is a reference to that beautiful King James phrase in 1 Corinthians 13 that we see as through a glass darkly. And Paul this is the hymn to love. It's very beautiful. But that chapter ends with Paul, discussing, to put it in bizarre theological terms and philosophical terms, he's discussing the epistemological gulf between God's knowledge of ourselves and our knowledge of God. And specifically, we don't know ourselves until we have a confrontation with our Creator. And that's not really going to happen until we pass over. I think at the core of this novel, which has a huge emphasis on empathy, right? I mean, like literally, Substance D destroys empathy in the sense that you lose empathy with yourself. But empathy is a form of knowledge, and the perfect empathy only comes from the Creator. So, it's his best. Okay, it's my favorite. I think his best is Ubik. But if you don't think you like science fiction, if you don't think it's good enough, that's fine. You've been told that. Read Philip K. Dick. Read A Scanner Darkly. If you've watched the movie, read the novel. It won't be spoiled. Either way. You can look up everything that happens in the novel and still enjoy it. But it's a massive, wonderful work of art. Absolutely divine. I love it. It's great. Read Ubik. Read Do Androids Dream of Electricity. My opinion, not as interesting. Blade Runner is important. I need to reread that one. Maybe my opinion will be a lot higher, but I've always thought it was funny how that is like the work for so many people. Then again, Ubik as a film adaptation would be nuts. I think I would enjoy it even if it was terrible, because it'd be so strange. Now, I want to emphasize a little more of his really good writing, and I want to read just another page. This is from Valis. I'm reading Valis now. I never had. This is some of the last novels he wrote, and it's very different, I can tell already, for him. First off, he's basically saying, I'm writing an autobiography of himself, and there's been no quote-unquote science fiction yet. But I just thought this was such an amazing page. I should mention that Valis, the first thing he tells you as you read this is, okay, our protagonist is a guy named, what is it? Horse Lover Fats. That'd be a totally dumb name. And then he says, oh, but it's me, but I have to get perspective of myself, so I'm writing in third person. Now, how I'm supposed to think about this, I'm still not totally sure, but it's just an important point. This protagonist is himself. These could literally be things that really happened to him, or they're just so thinly disguised. Anyway, I didn't finish this novel. I barely started it, but I love this page. And the only context I think is necessary is that a friend of his, who's a young woman, is asked him, can you collect 10 Nebutals because I think I've got about 40, and if I have 50, I know I'll be able to kill myself. And he lies and says he does, so that she drives up to meet him, and he plans on making sure she doesn't kill herself. Okay. Don't kill yourself, Fat said. Move in with me. I'm all alone. I really like you. Try it for a while, at least. We'll move your stuff up, me and my friends. There's lots of things we can do, like go places, like to the beach today. Isn't it nice here? To that, Gloria said nothing. It would really make me feel terrible, Fat said, for the rest of my life if you did away with yourself. Thereby, as he later realized, he presented her with all the wrong reasons for living. She would be doing it as a favor to others. He could not have found a worse reason to give her had he looked for years. Better to back the VW over her. This is why suicide hotlines are not manned by nitwits. Fat learned that later in Vancouver, when suicidal himself, he phoned the British Columbia Crisis Center and got expert advice. There was no correlation between this and what he told Gloria on the beach that day. Pausing to rub a small stone loose from her foot, Gloria said, I'd like to stay overnight at your place. Hearing this, Fat experienced involuntary visions of sex. Far out, he said, which was the way he talked in those days. The counterculture possessed a whole book of phrases which bordered on meaning nothing. Fat used to string a bunch of them together. He did so now, deluded by his own carnality into imagining that he had saved his friend's life. His judgment, which wasn't worth much anyhow, dropped to a new nadir of acuity. The existence of a good person hung in a balance which Fat held, and all he could think of now was the prospect of scoring. I can dig it, he prattled away as they walked, out of sight. A few days later, she was dead. They spent that night together, sleeping fully dressed. They did not make love. The next afternoon, Gloria drove off, ostensibly to get her stuff from her parents' house in Modesto. He never saw her again. For several days, he waited for her to show up, and then one night the phone rang, and it was her ex-husband, Bob. Where are you right now? Bob asked. The question bewildered him. He was at home, where his phone was, in the kitchen. Bob sounded calm. I'm here, Fat said. Gloria killed herself today, Bob said. So, great writing. An author who deserved far more literary praise and merit. Obviously, he's totally well known. He's very well respected. Every year, there's like 2 or 3 things related to Philip K. Dick that become adaptations. But he's the kind of writer that should be seen, not every work, but many of his works that should be seen as high literary, excellent work, as high literary fiction. It just happens to be sci-fi, it just happens to be speculative, it just happens to be not realism. Finally, last thing I'm going to say, and this is kind of a hive mind question. If there's one genre I can't stand, it's high fantasy. Don't like Tolkien, I'll get into that later. I tried George R. R. Martin, didn't like it. I found this book at my school. The Gorman Gast novels. They're supposed to be high fantasy, which means huge world building, all these things. But what I've heard is, unlike Tolkien, this is an author who understood that modernism happened. So hopefully I'll get into this at some point and report back, and I'll then be a person who could say, I also like high fantasy. Anyway, have a wonderful everything.